So I want to apologize for the bait and switch of the title that was originally advertised for this talk. So on the program, unlike on the paper, on the program it says against the interpretation construction distinction. So 2 or 3 years ago, I did the Nathanson lecture here. Embedded within the Nathanson lecture, where I talked mostly about technical language, were a few pages in the printed version in which I took the observations about technical language as substantially undercutting the distinction between interpretation and construction, which at the time and still has been developed at great depth and sophistication by some number of people, Larry Solomon, Keith Whittington most prominently. And then I thought that I would use the opportunity of speaking here to expand that critique. In the process of further thinking, further writing, further research, I became a little bit less critical of the distinction than I was in the 2 pages some years ago. So the title of Against the Interpretation Construction Distinction is, as I said, a little bit of a bait and switch. Still, although I didn't follow the original plan, my thinking headed in different directions. Although I thought that my earlier critique perhaps overstated things, I think there are still issues, there are still problems worth spending a little bit of time on. So, okay, the basic idea as developed by Larry, Keith, and some number of others, and as developed by Francis Lieber almost 200 years ago, and as developed by Edwin Patterson and some number of others in the context of contract law, the basic idea is that there is a distinction between interpreting a legal document, that is, trying to determine the linguistic meaning or linguistic content of the words of the language in the relevant documents, from the process of construction, that is, the process of applying that linguistic content to particular problems, particular issues, and so on. That's the basic distinction. It has its obvious relevance in originalist constitutional scholarship, but also equal relevance to statutory interpretation, equal relevance to contract law, and some number of others. So if we think about the distinction between interpretation and construction, we can think of it as being offered against 2 quite different opponents, 2 quite different foils. So one foil, foil number 1, we might call Justice Scalia. That is, there is one view, perhaps associated whether accurately or inaccurately with Justice Scalia, that would say that interpreting a legal document, determining its linguistic content, whether that be on the basis of original public meaning or contemporary public meaning or something else, that determining the linguistic content is more or less the end of the matter. And insofar as there are people who believe that interpreting the documents in this sense, discovering the linguistic content, is most of what needs to be done, then the distinction between interpretation and construction can be understood as a challenge to that view. A challenge that says, in effect, yes, we understand what the document's public meaning, or what the language's public meaning, or what the statute's public meaning was at the time of enactment. We understand that, but that doesn't end the question. That doesn't end the inquiry, because now when we turn to the process of construction, now a whole bunch of other legal ideas, legal ideals, legal goals, legal principles, legal everything else comes into play that discovering the linguistic content does not help us with. So call Justice Scalia foil number one. Foil number two, quite different from Justice Scalia, is Lon Fuller. And here, using Lon Fuller as foil number two is largely something of my doing. We don't find references to Fuller very much in the interpretation construction scholarship, but one way of understanding one of the opponents against whom the proponents of the interpretation construction distinction are arguing is Fuller's view that all of the language in all legal documents, all of the language in all legal instruments has to be understood in the context of there being legal documents, legal instruments, and therefore existing within legal institutions with legal goals. This is perhaps most clear with reference to Fuller's discussion of Hart's No Vehicles in the Park example, where although Fuller is not 100% clear, he seems to suggest that what is a vehicle for purposes of the No Vehicles in the Park regulation is not necessarily what is a vehicle for purposes of ordinary language. So therefore, when Fuller offers his example of a statue of a vehicle erected as a war memorial by some number of military veterans and challenging Hart by saying, in effect, do you mean to say that by the ordinary meaning of the No Vehicles in the Park rule, this ought to be excluded? Fuller seems to be hinting that we don't have to even get that far because understanding what is and what is not a vehicle involves consideration of the rule within which that word is located and the legal and interpretive context within which the rule is located, and therefore even words commonly part of ordinary language like vehicle take on a special technical meaning when used in the law. This is entirely consistent with some of the things that Fuller had said much earlier about legal fictions. In writing about legal fictions, Fuller expressed great sympathy, although realism about its possibilities, but nevertheless great sympathy with the idea expressed by Edwin Patterson, among others, and Holmes at times, that perhaps law would work better if it had entirely a language of its own, that law would work better if we understood all legal language and all legal terms as having legal meanings and not just ordinary meanings. And as I suggested in the lecture a couple of years ago, Fuller's most obvious opponent on this issue is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, when he suggested that it ought to be unlawful to give legal advice for money, which he suggested in all seriousness, which apparently was the only mode in which he operated, wanted to create the appropriate incentives for Parliament to write laws in such a way that they could be understood by ordinary people without the corrupting intervention of lawyers in pursuit of profits and judges in pursuit of power. So distinguishing interpretation from construction, therefore, has these two quite different foils. Now, that said, my tentative conclusion is that the interpretation construction distinction, as Patterson recognized, as some number of other contract scholars have recognized, is an important distinction when we are thinking about documents that are understood as having been written in more or less ordinary language. Contracts are a good example, many statutes as well. The distinction, I now think, also works for a large number of technical terms that have quite obvious and concrete reference, even if the reference requires some knowledge of law in order to understand it. Letters of marque and reprisal, for example. But once we turn to legal terms that are constitutive, such as trial of impeachment, that is, legal terms that draw on and make reference to an institution that is created by law in much the same way that home runs are created, constituted by the rules of baseball, and checkmates are constituted by the rules of chess, as H.L.A. Hart and then John Searle have developed. This also, it seems to me now, but it didn't a few years ago, fits in pretty well with the interpretation, construction, distinction, but with some weaknesses. The greatest weakness comes with respect to evaluative terms. Speedy, as in speedy trial. Unreasonable, as in unreasonable search and seizure. Due, as in due process. Equal, as in equal protection. Full, as in full faith and credit. Just, as in just compensation. Necessary, as in necessary and proper. All of these in philosophical terminology may be thick descriptions or thick terminology. They are evaluative terms. Because they are evaluative terms, it is impossible to interpret them, to find out, to determine their linguistic content without making reference to the goals, principles, values, institutions, and everything else of law. And if all of the legal stuff, to use the appropriate technical term, comes in at the interpretive stage, then it seems to me that the basic point, at least for these terms, of the interpretation, construction, distinction evaporates.